Well, hello and welcome to our second informal moderated discussion in 2 days on the issues that are going on in the Caucasus, and particularly on Nagorno Karabakh. We have a large panel that I will have my colleague Maia introduce in about a second. My name is Aaron Stein. I'm the Director of Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. And this is an effort as part of an ongoing series to respond to world events as they happen amongst our scholars and pulling from our experts in our network to discuss these issues and to take from one of my colleagues, Nick, who's also on the call, whom Maia will introduce, is to explain why Americans and people around the world should care about them. So with that, Maia, I will turn the floor over to you for the introductions, and so that we can get going right away with the discussion. I will, before I do that, encourage everybody to ask as many questions as possible using the question and answer button in Zoom. I assume everybody is familiar with it by now. And Maia, I will speak for her, has placed some maps into the chat box. So if people are a little bit unfamiliar with geography or the terrain, they can follow along. So with that, Maia, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Aaron. Welcome, everybody. This is our second day of talking about the conflict in Nagorno Karabakh. Yesterday, we hosted Arzugay Bulayeva, who's a journalist from Azerbaijan living in Istanbul, who gave us a sense of what's happening on the ground. And as you all know, the conflict erupted, well, 30 years ago, but reignited on September 27th, and shelling continues. We have over 300 dead at this point, and a large portion of that are civilian victims. We have a group of panelists here. We're very fortunate at FPRI to have such a vast network of experts. Just within our group, we have 3 people who have written their dissertations on post-Soviet frozen conflicts, and including the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. Let me introduce our speakers. Again, I do want to encourage everyone to send in their questions through Q&A. I will paste some additional maps into chat on the right-hand side of your screens. And everyone will make some remarks, but mostly we will keep this conversational, and we will welcome any of your questions and inquiries. Today we are joined by Robert Hamilton, who is our Black Sea Fellow at FPRI. We have Nick Gvozdev, who is a Senior Fellow at FPRI and also the editor of our scholarly journal Orbis. Aaron Stein, you all know him. He is the Director of Research here at FPRI. Elene Melikishvili is calling in from London. She holds a PhD in international relations from the War Studies Department at King's College London, and she's been looking at the South Caucasus security issues for nearly a decade. And we're also joined by Miro Popkhadze, who is a fellow here at FPRI. He was the Georgian Ministry of Defense representative to the UN from 2015 to 2019. And before that, he was the Assistant Defense Attaché at the Georgian Embassy in Washington. With that, I think what I will do is I'll ask Elene to give us a background of this conflict, how it started, and sort of give us some of the key issues that remain. Then I will ask Bob to add to that and tell us a little bit more about specifically the ethnic conflict, details about the ethnic conflict. Then we will look at Georgia's perspective, which Miro will talk about. Nick will look at Russia's role. Aaron will tell us a little bit about where Turkey stands in this conflict. And then we'll talk about just the broader geopolitical consequences of it, what's at stake. And of course, we will definitely address the question of why this matters to the US, why this matters for Western policymakers, and why we should all keep an eye on it, although our attention is being diverted into a million different directions right now. So with that, Elena, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to the panel. So it's a bit, I think it's the most complex conflict in the South Caucasus compared to Abkhazia and South Ossetia, because Nagorno-Karabakh is basically a dispute between two countries, Armenia and Azerbaijan. The current crisis, actually, I would sort of detach myself from saying that it's an ethnic hatred going back to centuries. No, this conflict is a product of the 20th century policy making, let's say. Everything we see today has actually started in 1987, to be precise, when a geologist from Armenia wrote a letter addressed to then the chairman of the Communist Party of the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev. And basically the appeal was that Mr. Gorbachev was asked to look into the opportunity and possibility of changing the jurisdiction of Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Okrug from Azerbaijan to Armenia. Basically, the idea of the letter, the main sort of argument of the letter was that in 1921, when the borders in the South Caucasus were set by Bolshevik government of the time, Armenia was treated unjustly. And they were asking Gorbachev, like they were hailing that, oh, we have now perestroika, you want to change the USSR, so let's start a change here so that we do find a just solution. And when I say just, this word is repeated so many times in this letter, that they wanted a just solution for Armenia. And that's how this dispute has reignited in 87. Then there was another letter. Then there were like Armenian intellectuals, again in Yerevan, appealing and asking Gorbachev to change the jurisdiction, which was basically an amendment to the USSR's 1977 constitution, which Gorbachev wasn't ready even to think about, as I can say now, like looking with a hindsight now, they were not ready even to think about it. So this also, it's interesting because we are now seeing the war of words and adjectives, and in that letter it's very vivid how anti-Turk the letter is. The letter says that, oh, Azerbaijanis are Turks, and that Turkey is a sort of alien state, and why should the USSR be willing to accommodate Turkish interests? And also it sort of emphasizes the insecurities of Armenian nation vis-a-vis Turkey. So it's very, very cleverly, if you like, crafted piece of work, which highlighted the right, I think, so that you can mobilize the nation around the flag. So the response from the Kremlin was that, oh, you know, we will think about it, but, you know, no, basically. Then there were skirmishes during, then in, the thing continued in 1988, and there were skirmishes between Armenians and Azerbaijanis, and there 2 or 3 people died there. So even today, we don't know who killed those protesters, because most of the sources say that it was actually a policeman and not the protesters themselves. So it's kind of a gray area. Then there were again the nationalists and intelligentsia in Yerevan and as well in Baku were sort of adhering to nationalist rhetoric. And I think that's when they lost control over the narrative. So it became very nationalist, based on ethnicity, based on references to 1915 genocide. And so we came to sort of a Schmittian world where Armenians dehumanized Azerbaijanis, so that you have an existentially alien enemy, and who is a stranger, so you can annihilate them. And also making references to history and putting this into sort of Christianity versus Muslim sort of world dispute. And that's sort of started and escalated. And then there was Sumgait. Sumgait was a small town outside Baku, and it was like it's also a very gray area, because everyone who participated, the Azerbaijani citizens who participated in the massacre of Sumgait, ended up to be somehow all unemployed former prisoners. So this also sort of gives you the political dimension, the idea of how political it was, and how a political statement for one of the nationalists actually triggered this massacre in Sumgait, when he said, he said it on state TV that we have refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh who are ethnic Azerbaijanis. So what we do, we take over the houses of Armenians who live in Azerbaijan. And actually, a lot of Armenians lived at the time in Azerbaijan. So they started with, it continued with Sumgait. And basically, the other part is that the Soviet government, at the time I'm talking now, it's the Soviet Union, still exists. And Gorbachev is the president of the USSR, or chairman of the Communist Party. But no one did anything to prevent it. They were sort of sending some commissions, special representatives to Nagorno-Karabakh, thinking that, we have to do something, we have to boost the economy, etc., etc. But the sort of war of adjectives, the discursive war has begun without Moscow actually noticing it, or it could be that Moscow didn't want to notice it, and then just they allowed it to happen. Then there was later on, there was sort of another massacre, which was which was in Khojali, and Armenia. It was Armenians who were attacking now Azerbaijani civilians, and it was one of the bloodiest massacres of that conflict. And what then happened was basically Armenians attacked Azerbaijanis, and their attack was very successful. And they also occupied the neighboring regions, which are proper Azerbaijan, proper. Even Armenia acknowledges and recognizes that those regions around Nagorno-Karabakh is Azerbaijan. And for 30 years, there is this ceasefire, which from time to time there are some skirmishes and shootings, but nothing like this we see. We've been watching since 27th of September. And the interesting fact is that de jure, I mean, according to international law, it is Azerbaijani territory, because the Soviet Union borders were recognized as borders of the consequent states which emerged out of the Soviet Union. And the line is that since this conflict and after the ceasefire, this discursive war of adjectives, of historic narratives continues. And it has not changed, even though the government in Armenia particularly changed a lot. This line towards Karabakh has not changed. The dimension is that they are Azerbaijanis, they are our enemies. And now, of course, that Turkey is sort of supporting Azerbaijan, and Turkey has been emphasizing that it's the one nation with two states, etc. It of course helps this narrative to exist and to be in this condition. But also we have to know that when I mentioned that this happened in 1921, both sides basically use historic facts, but they are not considered to be facts, because we sort of don't, it's historical artifacts, let's say. They refer to history as sort of their argument for their own claims, territorial claims. But we have to remember, and there is a study about this, Victor Schnirelman, I think it was in 1990, when he did a study, and he wrote that in 1920s, histories of both Armenia and Azerbaijan were sort of engineered by Bolsheviks to meet certain aims and objectives of the Soviet state and Soviet ideology. So basically, this idea of sort of dividing regions, what went to Azerbaijan, what went to Armenia, and even Georgia, just Georgians don't have any sort of territorial claims currently with Armenia and Azerbaijan at that scale. I mean, there are some sort of border issues, but not at that scale. That sort of geographical engineering, if you like, was part of the Soviet policy, Bolshevik policy. The Soviet Union started emerged later on. So what they basically use as argument is the product of the Bolshevik policy. And I do not think it has been widely acknowledged, even by the political elites who are in this struggle today. And I think it's important to sort of go back to that period and understand that there are certain things which might be arguable, if not some of them could be outright lies. And this sort of history being considered as a monument, as a something unchangeable, I refer to Foucault here, that sort of creates the regime of truth in the both countries, which is problematic. And I think that is sort of the space which needs more exploration for finding some sort of accommodating solution for both parties.
Elena, thank you so much for that background. That I think that was really important, I think, for our audience to hear, especially about the whole Bolshevik engineering of the region and how that has shaped today's realities. Bob, I want to give you a chance to add anything you want to add to the background, but maybe you could also bring us to the conflict right now, especially the military aspects of it, the shelling that we have seen, and so on and so forth.
Sure, thanks, Maya. And Elena did a great job laying, I think, the historical foundations. And I agree with, with what you said, Elena, that the roots, the modern roots at least, lie largely in the Soviet ethno-federal system, right? Which tied ethnic and national groups to territory and gave many of them autonomy within the context of a larger territorial unit. In this case, the Nagorno Karabakh Autonomous Okrug inside of Soviet Azerbaijan. And then when Moscow was able to mitigate that conflict between Armenians and Azeris, between Georgians and Abkhaz, between Moldovans and Transnistrians, for example, those conflicts were able to be, were kept sort of at a low boil or at a simmer. When the Soviet state then, when the center collapsed and Moscow was unable or unwilling, as you said, seemed to be uninterested in the last few years of the Soviet Union, probably because it was consumed, the Kremlin was consumed with its own internal problems, right? Trying to manage the collapse of the Soviet Union. But anyway, when Moscow became unable to mitigate that conflict, and when the Soviet Union collapsed, that's when you see a lot of these ethno-territorial conflicts arise, especially when in places where you had, you know, what political scientists will call ethnic entrepreneurs, right? Leaders who seized upon these pre-existing ethnic divisions, the pre-existing narratives, and then mobilized followers along ethnic lines and escalated conflict between groups. And so I do think that, you know, largely the roots of this conflict lie in the 20th century. They lie in Soviet ethno-federal policies. And then when you had, they put things into conflict with each other. For instance, you know, the norms or legal principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, which the Georgian state, the Azeri state, the Moldovan state deployed to defend their position, and the principle of self-determination, which the separatist regions deployed to support their position. And in countries where you have, as you did in a lot of these post-Soviet states, de jure, right, constitutionally, you may not have an ethnic definition of citizenship, but the rhetoric would lead you to believe, if you were a minority in some of these countries, that your citizenship rights were not protected, that you might even physically be in danger, right? So easy to see in that context how some of these conflicts escalated in the waning days of the Soviet Union or the early days of independence. Moving from the roots of the conflict to the initial ceasefire in 1994, and as you said, Yelena, there have been several escalations, you know, since '94. Nothing like this, right? Nothing to the extent that we see now. I've thought for a long time that this conflict is the most dangerous of the frozen conflicts inside the former Soviet Union for several reasons. And I've likened it to India-Pakistan without nuclear weapons, right? And in some ways, because there's no peacekeeping force on the ground between Armenia and Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh, in the way there's no international peacekeeping force in the Indo-Pakistani conflict. You have great power involvement this time, certainly on the side of Turkey, and Aaron will talk more about that. You have vast differences in state wealth and defense budget between Azerbaijan and Armenia. The latest figures I could come up with, the Azerbaijani defense budget in 2018 was about 1.7 billion US dollars. The Armenian defense budget has fluctuated between about 450 and 600 million. So in any case, the Azeri defense budget is at least 3 times as large as the Armenian defense budget. And this is also a conflict. So this is a conflict in which at least one side, I think, believes there's a military solution available. In the other conflicts in the former Soviet Union, what we call the frozen conflicts, Transnistria, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, there really is no military solution available, certainly to the state, to the Georgian or Moldovan state, just because of the presence of Russian forces in those regions. This is a conflict where, at least I think from the Azerbaijani side, because they lost the initial war, they're unhappy with the status quo that emerged from the peace agreement in 1994. They have vastly superior resources to Armenia now over the last 20 years or so because of oil and gas money, because there is no international peacekeeping force on the ground to sort of keep the two sides apart and mitigate conflict between them. This one, for a long time, has been the frozen conflict in the former Soviet Union. I think that most people thought was the most dangerous one, and we're seeing that now. In terms of, and we can get into this in the Q&A, and so I'll end my remarks here. Military aspects of it, it appears that the initial Azerbaijani offensive starting on the 27th of September was focused on a couple of districts that lie outside of Nagorno-Karabakh proper, that are a little more low-lying, and therefore they're not so mountainous, and so they're easier military targets. But it quickly escalated from there. One of the, I think, things that's worth discussing in the context of this conflict in terms of military lessons is the fact that the drone warfare is here to stay. And if you don't have a defense against strike by drones, the Armenians right now have shown that they're unable to defend a lot of their forces against drone strikes. That can turn the balance of a conflict very quickly. The latest numbers I'm able to get from media sources in terms of tanks destroyed by Azerbaijani drones, Armenian tanks destroyed, is 42. Now, if that's accurate, that's almost 1/3 of the total number of tanks in the Armenian armed forces. Some of those also are tanks from the Nagorno-Karabakh army, from the Nagorno-Karabakh armed forces. But nevertheless, even allowing for the fact that the media often calls things tanks that aren't tanks, in other words, it may be an armored personnel carrier or something else, 42 armored vehicles destroyed by drones in the context of about a 2-week war is very significant. And it's also similar to what we saw in Idlib, Syria, in the early part of this year with the Turkish drones. And many of these Azeri drones that are doing the strikes are provided by Turkey. So I think that's something worth looking at, and something worth a thread that's worth pulling on in terms of military lessons from this conflict. That if you do not have a defense against drone strikes, especially if you're an armored mobile force, you're going to be at a really, really big disadvantage. So I'll leave my remarks there, and I'm happy to return to any of these themes in the Q&A.
Thank you, Bob. I want to turn to Miro because one of the most nervous neighbors probably in this conflict is Georgia, for many reasons. And historically, Georgia has had great relations with both countries, and oftentimes it has served as the convening place for dialogues, for a neutral place where the two sides could meet and try to resolve the differences. Miro, can you tell me a little bit about what are the Georgians thinking right now? How does the Georgian Ministry of Defense see this? What are some of the immediate threats they see? And maybe you could talk a little bit about the whole issue with how Russia cannot access Armenia to provide supplies unless it goes through Georgia, but that's not quite possible.
Yeah, well, Maya, thank you very much for the invitation. I think this is very significant issue now in the region. And as my colleagues rightly said, so Georgia is actually shares borders with both sides, and it is very significant for Georgia to have stability and peace in these two countries. As you rightly mentioned, Georgia historically had very good relationship with both countries, with Armenia, but right now with Azerbaijan, Georgia has strategic relationships. So in the past 30 years, both countries have managed to establish projects of geopolitical significance. So what happens in Azerbaijan and in Armenia in this regard is very important. But what is a concern in Georgia at this point is that the breakdown of international multilateral framework, so-called European security architecture. Okay, so we see, especially in the post, that provided like security and stability to the region. But what is very concerning to me, especially, is that we see sense of regionalization of the conflict. We see the lack of interest, profile, and leverage of Western powers in this particular conflict. So this is a challenge for Georgia because, as you know, like Azerbaijan and Armenia, Georgia does not have any strategic partner that could come and defend Georgia's security and territorial integrity. For example, Azerbaijan shares strategic partnership with Turkey, and the agreement explicitly stipulates that these countries will defend each other in times of war if one demands right to self-defense. Or Armenia is a part of the CSTO, like Collective Security Organization, a Russian-led bloc. So Russia can come and defend. So while Georgia enjoys strategic partnership with the United States, United States commitment to Georgia falls short to military treaty commitment. So if something happens in Georgia, United States won't be obliged to come to Tbilisi's rescue. So this is a very significant element that's very concerning. So that's why Georgia, I think, needs to walk on the tightrope. On the one hand, to maintain its neutrality, but on the other hand, to avoid being dragged into these conflicts, because we see that there are lots of powers outside want to have Georgia dragged into this conflict. And one of the biggest problem I think we have, and in the past we actually did it very well in this regard. We have both ethnic minorities in the region. We have Armenians and we have Azerbaijanis. So our main challenge is to ensure their peaceful coexistence during this war. Okay, in the past few days, what we have seen is that these both ethnic groups rallied around the flag. They protested. They were actually very active, and this effective mobilizing capacity we now see in Georgia could be exploited by foreign powers, for example, like Russia. So this is a big challenge, and these challenges probably are quite many. For example, in the short term, I mean, so we can see the rallies, we can see the protests, we may see some attempts to send some questionable cargo to Azerbaijan or Armenia. We may see some cargo carrier trucks stopped at the checkpoints connecting Georgia and Turkey, or we may see like damage or like cutting of fiber optic cables connecting Georgia with us. So these are significant challenge. And also, as I said, we have strategic partnership with Azerbaijan, and we have Georgia's crisscrossed by pipelines and by roads and railways. So this could be another like subject of attacks or sabotage by Russian or other forces in Georgia. This is very significant. Also, what I see is that the economic challenge also will be very important for Georgia, especially in the post-COVID-19 world where Georgia is struggling very much. Azerbaijan and Turkey, they are the biggest investors in Georgia. So if this war escalates and continues, we actually will have decrease of these investments in Georgia. Also, as you know, Georgia is a destination of tourists, and we have lots of tourists coming from Turkey, we have come from Azerbaijan, Armenia. So this also will have, I think, very significant impact on Georgian economy. As a matter of fact, in the past a few days, we saw the Turkish lira is depreciating. We have lots of Georgians working there. They get paid in lira. So so said remittances towards Georgia may also decrease. So that's another challenge. Also, I would say in the short term, the humanitarian, we may see a wave of refugees coming to Georgia. But what drew my attention in the past few days was that Azerbaijani statement, they have capability, sophisticated weapons that it could reach to Armenia's nuclear power plant and destroy it. So if that happens, can you imagine it's going to be a humanitarian disaster for the region? But one of the biggest challenges, I think, and always had in Georgia is that the Russian role. So what we see in Russia and Moscow, Russia is quite silent. Russia is taking back step and watching what's going on, but it does not mean they don't know what to do. It means that they actually, everything is going according to the plan, a Russian plan. We see that Russia is punishing Pashinyan because for being Democrat, because of the reforms he's doing. So this is a message to Azerbaijan that Russia does not tolerate democracy in that country. And also there is another message that Azerbaijan that Russia is tolerating Azerbaijan's boldness, if you will. And if Azerbaijan comes out victorious, this could build a sense of trust between these countries, and this positive dynamic could be translated into strategic projects going from Russia, Azerbaijan to Armenia, Iran, and this could actually have very unpleasant to Georgia's strategic partnership with Azerbaijan. Georgia will be actually left out. So this is another challenge. Or Russia may be sending peacekeepers, because this was kind of Lavrov's plan. So they want to send peacekeepers, and we know from our experience, Georgia, what they do. Peacekeeper is another extension of Russia base or foot on the ground. So it means that they will have much more control over these pipelines and fiber optic cables and railroads coming from Asia to Europe. I think this overall dynamic is very concerning, and there are lots of moving parts, and if West does not get involved, address these challenges, Georgia, as I said, will be very, very, I mean, Georgia's vulnerable. It will be in a very, very dire situation as we move forward.
Thank you, Miro. And before we get to the West and what the West could be doing here, I want to turn to Aaron and ask him to tell us a little bit more about the role of Turkey here. We spoke about this quite a bit yesterday and learned some new things from Arzu as well. So maybe you could give us a view from Istanbul.
Sure, Istanbul via Philadelphia. Well, thank you everybody for joining, and thanks all my other colleagues and panelists for an in-depth conversation. I'll be very brief. I mean, what I think we're seeing on the point of the Turks is that we are seeing the implementation of a change in their foreign policy. And this foreign policy, it's not asynchronous for Ankara to be tilting towards the Azeri side. I think that that's basically a continuation of the status quo. But what you see is that the barrier to entry for Turkish military intervention is lower than it used to be in the past. And what I mean by that is that there is now a blueprint that Ankara has that it can apply to conflicts in its near abroad, either in Syria or in Nagorno Karabakh, or even slightly farther afield in Libya, where it can bring military forces. And as Bob was talking, or Bob was talking about earlier, is that they can significantly attrite a weaker force on behalf of either itself or, in this case, an allied military. And that these operations that Ankara is undergoing is very much in line with a change in the country's direction in foreign policy. I would date to around 2016, which is the previous era in Turkish foreign policy under this government, beginning in 2002 and continuing up until 2016, was one of consensus building, engagement, outreach. The tagline was zero problems with neighbors, and economic integration and linkages and all those things in its region. With the collapse, particularly in the security order in the Middle East and more broadly in the Eastern Mediterranean, and now to the north of Turkey, or I guess northeast of Turkey, is a commitment to using military force and hard power. Erdogan said this quite explicitly in this big speech he gave to village heads, but it was just a vehicle for him to say Turkey will no longer be the consensus builder in the region. Turkey will be the country that uses its power to try and alter the status quo in its own ways, in ways that are advantageous to its own interests. And so you see right now, Ankara has quite obviously intervened on behalf of the Azeri side. I would bet quite strongly is that Turkey is operating the drones, that's imagery is making its way onto social media and to Turkish networks, or at least is co-located and working quite closely with the Azeri military, and has even gone as far as to provide its own private military contractors pulled from the Syrians that it trains, and largely from the refugee population, IDP population from inside Syria and inside its own borders, to deploy into Nagorno-Karabakh on behalf of the Azeri side. And they're hesitant, at least as of this morning, to push quickly for a ceasefire. I don't see Ankara as particularly enthused with the latest Russian moves, and perhaps Nick can talk about that a little bit, and very much thinks that perhaps time is on their side. Now, I'm a little skeptical of this. I do think, yes, the attrition is quite high on the Armenian side, but the conflict, doesn't lead itself, and perhaps maybe somebody would disagree, to military breakout, and that you run into very hard terrain. And I'm just going to check the date now. It's October 9th, and I don't know when it starts to exactly start to snow up there, but my guess is it's relatively soon, and the weather starts to turn pretty poor. So I do wonder how long this is going to go on for, not in terms of a commitment by both sides to continue the fighting, but whether or not the conflict may bog down a little bit as we move forward into October. So with that, I'll stop and turn it over to Nick or Maia to turn it over to Nick to round out the conversation.
Nick, definitely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Thank you for having me be part of this group. A lot of great points have already been brought up. Let me just sort of play cleanup here and address a couple issues, and then I guess we'll turn it over to the general discussion. So I took a few notes down here. The first thing, I just wanted to go back to something Bob and Aaron have said about the drones. This is something that I think is a game changer. People are looking at this, studying it very carefully. Let me just give a plug for the current fall issue of Orbis, which is now out, which is around the theme of emerging technologies and national security. And for those that are interested in this topic, you might find the interviews with General Breedlove and Admiral Winfield on this subject to be of interest. I was dipping into the Q&A part of the call, and Trudy Rubin anticipated actually several, in her questions that she has posted, several of the comments that I wanted to address. And so I'd like to throw a couple of observations out. And the first is, why is this happening now? Why is this happening in 2020 as opposed to 2018 or 2016 or 2010? And I think we have to look both at what's happening in the world. The world is distracted. The coronavirus pandemic is reducing countries' willingness to want to interfere. I don't think it's accidental that we've had this breakout of fighting in the Caucasus. We have tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean. We had China and India have border clashes this year. There's a sense that we're kind of in a free-for-all, and the United States is distracted both by COVID and also by its presidential elections. So this is the time to try to change things on the ground, change the facts on the ground in order to improve your bargaining position or to be in a better position come 2021. So I think that that is part of this. The other factor I think we have to take into account is the domestic political factor in both Armenia and Azerbaijan. The promise of the revolution in Armenia at the end of 2018 has been running out. A lot of enthusiasm that the rise of Nikol Pashinyan was going to lead to major changes. Life would get better. That hasn't quite panned out the way it was expected. And in Azerbaijan, we are in the middle of a generational transition of power, where the old guard, who was part of the circle around the elder Aliyev over the last year, has been asked to or been retired from power. The old guard shot back after the initial Armenia-Azeri clashes in July of this year, that the new guys, the young people, don't know what they're doing. They're not good at running the country, that they are giving up advantages. And so I think that there is some degree of domestic politics in here. And also, of course, Azerbaijan is suffering from the oil price collapse, which has impacted all of the oil exporters. This was supposed to be the year of some great new economic development and reform in Azerbaijan to address some of the unrest that has been simmering in the country over the last year. That's not happening now because the funds aren't going to be there because of where the oil price is. Specifically about Russia, turning now to Moscow's position in all of this and Moscow's, the Kremlin's approach. My sense is that the Kremlin, by sitting back, has actually played a reasonably good geopolitical hand. There was a sense that in the first days of the crisis, oh, Moscow must intervene, it must do something. If it's a major power, why isn't it acting? And the Russian approach has been to sit back a bit and let this conflict play out in ways that actually benefit Moscow geopolitically. And let me identify kind of the four benefits that, as of now, Moscow has seemingly accrued. The first is because of Turkey's ties with Azerbaijan, the sense that if there was a clash, what happens if Turkish personnel were involved in a clash with the Armenians? Would this bring in the Russians? And Turkey kind of checked with its NATO allies and once again found that along with what it's doing in the Eastern Mediterranean, that its NATO allies, particularly France, were not going to have Turkey's back. This serves the Russian interest of continuing to drive a wedge between Turkey and the rest of NATO, conveying to the Turks that your NATO partners don't really have your interests at heart. And so why don't you continue what Turkey has been doing over the last number of years of finding practical accommodations with Russia that don't always work out. We see the tensions in Syria and in Libya, but for the most part, Moscow has been pretty adept at taking advantage of this fault line that has emerged between Turkey and the rest of NATO. This, of course, is also a way to punish the current Armenian leadership, because after the revolution, what we saw was an Armenian leadership that was reaching out, particularly to France and the United States, was saying all the right things about we don't want to downgrade our relationship with Russia, but we want greater balance. And we've seen how Russia has very, very carefully parsed its defense obligations to Armenia under the collective security treaty that they have. And that has been, first of all, the Russians say, look, we all recognize Nagorno-Karabakh as juridically being the territory of Azerbaijan. So if the fighting is on the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, there is no way we're going to invoke, you can invoke the defense treaty because Armenia proper has not been attacked. And it's very telling. Bob, maybe you have more updated information, but a day ago I was looking at a map that showed where the strikes have taken place, where bombings, shelling, and it's quite telling that all of the attacks have been in Nagorno-Karabakh, with the exception of accidental overshoots or things like that. That there's been no deliberate targeting of Armenia. Of Armenian proper, of Armenian territory, at least as far as I can tell from looking at that map, or at least something that couldn't plausibly be described as accidental, right? Oh yes, we meant the missile went off course, or something happened and a strike landed inside the borders of Armenia. And that, I think, has been that the Azeri side understands that as long as they do nothing to really strike Armenia proper in force, that the Russians are not going to intervene. And this is a way to tell Pashinyan and the Armenian government, you have a problem with this, call Donald Trump, call Emmanuel Macron. You are courting them, let them help you. And in some ways, this is an extension of what I like to call the Gaddafi rule, that the Russians let Muammar Gaddafi go because he was playing, he wanted to cozy up to the West, and then when he was under threat and he was calling the Russians saying, come help me, and they said, call your friends in London and Paris and Washington. If they've turned against you, don't come to us. So I think that there's been this sobering message to Armenia that you wanted to be more equidistant, you wanted to play a bit more with the West, you wanted to talk about democracy and the like. Well, let your newfound friends in the U.S. Congress and elsewhere, let them come help you if that's what you want. And again, that sends a pretty critical message. Baku, I think, over the last week has understood the importance of staying on Russia's good side. President Aliyev, in a number of his comments, has praised kind of Russian neutrality, the Russian constructive role. The Azeris, I think, are well aware that, Miro talked about this, right? All of these pipelines, interconnections, that if the Russians wanted to let things get out of hand, they can shut the Southern Energy Corridor down. We saw that in the 2008 Georgia war, that the Russians kind of sent that little subtle signal of pipelines can be shut down, pipelines can be destroyed, railways can be destroyed, communication lines, and I think that's the sense to Baku of, you don't want to completely foreclose any of your, you may have a close relationship with Turkey, but again, why Russia's always incentivized Baku to retain a degree of relationship with Moscow. And I think that is being borne out. Finally, and to bring this back, remember several weeks ago, we were all speculating about, the Europeans were going to impose major sanctions on the Russians because of the Alexei Navalny incident. That talk seemingly has disappeared. And I think you have quietly Europeans reevaluating, looking at the dangers posed to the Southern Energy Corridor in an active conflict zone, saying, maybe we should reconsider not sanctioning some of these, energy corridors between Russia and the European Union, Nord Stream 2, Arctic LNG, that maybe we should back off some of that talk. And it has been striking that we went from even key people in the German government 2 weeks ago talking about we might need to put Nord Stream 2 on a pause and think about a sanctions on it, to, as far as I can tell, that talk seemingly has disappeared over the last several days. And I think Russia looks at this as, as this conflict continues to simmer, it is useful in Russia's energy diplomacy vis-a-vis Europe. One last thing, not just talking about this from the Russian point, but maybe this is as a jumping off point to the general discussion, which is why should anyone on this side of the Atlantic care? There is a sense that this is a conflict far away in lands we know very little about. Why does this impact us? And to some extent, there is a sense that there is no perhaps direct impact, but the secondary impacts are quite important. If the U.S. is sort of absent from this process, as we've seen, Russia kind of has taken the lead in diplomacy. The United States is kind of very much playing a backseat role. We have the ongoing problems with what this does for the alliance, for NATO. This is not a good ultimate outcome if the outcome of this is that NATO continues to have these fracture points that then down the line create further problems for the United States. Certainly, the sense that the United States is a reliable partner that has capacity to help with mediation, that's taking a hit as well. We're going to see, I would assume, if it hasn't happened already, we're going to have, and it would be a very powerful image of when you have Azeri and Armenian foreign ministers in Moscow meeting not under the auspices of the Minsk group with France and the United States and the others, but meeting under Russian auspices only. And that sends a signal, as we've seen already over the last several years in the Middle East, in a number of Middle Eastern situations, that all roads used to go to Washington, well, but now there's a secondary road that leads to Moscow. And people in the region are taking note of this, saying, well, if the United States is AWOL or can't really be involved, then maybe we should turn to Russia. So this certainly has long-term implications for, the type of role that the United States hopes to play or to return to play in the international system. And I'll stop with that.
Thank you, Nick. I know there's quite a bit that everyone wants to address in the remarks that we've already made, and I want to work in some of the audience questions into the discussion, so we can keep this free-flowing, anyone can answer, but let me read a couple of questions. We got an email and a question in advance from Hans Gutbord in Tbilisi. He's asking, this is a zero-sum game. What one wins, the other loses. Do you see any way of transcending that? And let's combine that with this question of that we just received from Anna Davidson, which asks, what would be the markers of success for Russia in the truce talks? Is ceasefire the only goal? Obviously, there are no straightforward questions to this, but if anyone wants to take these, go ahead.
I'll jump in and start. I think one of the things that's important is for us not to mirror image what the US would do in these cases with what Russia seeks or what Russia's goals are. We have a bias to say, well, we want to solve everything, right? So if we don't solve a problem, by definition, we see that as failure, right? If we don't solve a situation, we equate that as we have not succeeded. Russia, as we've seen in Syria, as we've seen in Libya, as we've seen in a lot of places, is happy to jury-rig settlements that may not be long-term, but kind of kick the can down the road, keep options open, keep Russia involved as a player. I don't think that the Russians at this point say, that they're going to then unveil, here's our massive peace plan for Nagorno-Karabakh with, 50 different articles and a bunch of different annexes, and this is what's going to happen. I think if they can get a ceasefire, they have moderated, and then start a process, they jury rig it, they move it along, and they've had a reasonable degree of success with this already with Turkey in Syria and in Libya, where you jury rig something up. It works. You're not thinking long term. You're thinking, well, will this get us through next week, next month, next 6 months? But the success for Russia is it validates Russia's role as a player. And it allows Russia to claim success versus, again, coming back to the geopolitical consequences with the United States. The United States sketches out a broad agenda and then does not achieve it, which creates a sense of failure, right? So we have this narrative that the United States fails in Syria, it fails elsewhere. Russia then creates a narrative of Russia takes these very small steps, achieves tactical success, short-term success, and then people say, well, this is why we need to turn to the Russians to come in. So I think Miro is trying to jump in as well.
Yeah, please, anyone can unmute themselves and jump in. Miro, you're muted though.
Yes. So I want to make a couple of points regarding Russia and Georgia. So Russia has a military base in South Ossetia, like around 4,000 or 5,000 people, and it will actually try to increase pressure on Georgia to get land access to the Gyumri base in Armenia. So that's another challenge Georgia faces. And another challenge, and we also seen in the past few days, is that Russia's propaganda campaign portraying Georgia as a corridor to weapon supply to either side. So this kind of creates cleavage between Georgia and its neighbors. And I want to actually continue what Nick said, but in the post-Soviet space, Russia is more like a spoiler. It's been more like a spoiler than the stabilizer. So Russia needs these conflicts to be around, and it uses it as a means of control. That's why. So it's not in Russia's best interest to get to the final conflict resolution. Russia wants to have these conflicts, like in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, in Transnistria, and in Ukraine, as a means to control, because Russia does not provide the soft power. It uses its so-called sharp power to maintain the control. Thank you very much. That's.
Let's go with Elena next.
Just 1 minute. Thank you very much. I want to add to this the dimension of what will be the mark of Moscow's success. I think for Russia, it's a geopolitical imperative to keep the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and to make it to sort of calm the situation, but not make a big progress. And when Nick said that the Russians don't do the peace treaties with 50 articles and annexes, I think, yes, they don't, because that will be just too difficult to manage then. And whereas, as Miro said, it's easy to control once you have a bit of chaos in the neighborhood and you have enemies. Two countries which see enemies in each other. And I think here it's something that Armenia and Azerbaijan have to think about themselves without Russia, Turkey, or US, or whoever, is that they sort of failed to learn the lesson of the war and of these 30 years. And I think they continue to fail at learning the lesson. Thanks.
Bob, did you want to jump in, or let me read these 2 more questions and then give everybody a chance to speak. Please clarify Turkish use of a kind of foreign legion of Syrian and other fighters to advance its strategic aims in Nagorno-Karabakh, I would imagine. And another question says, what role has the UN played? And this may be a good place to also mention some of the UN resolutions that have have been made about this conflict in the past.
I can talk about the Syrians, you know, and just a disclaimer to the entire audience. My daughter just woke up and my wife is on a Zoom downstairs. So if you hear a baby noise, it's because she's at my feet, but she's happily playing on my computer at the moment. So yeah, it's just a disclaimer. You know, Ankara has sought to use Syrian mercenaries in a way to kind of mask its involvement in these conflicts. I mean, they're very overt in their advertisement of their sort of high-end involvement in these conflicts, beginning with the drone strikes. But if you look at a lot of Turkish public opinion polls, you know, it's not at all exciting for a large plurality, if not majority, of Turks to be involved in these conflicts abroad, particularly as I don't remember which panelist, I think Miro brought up, which is the collapse in the currency and coming economic difficulties. You know, certainly there's a nationalist underpinning to Ankara expanding its, you know, both military and its aggressiveness and assertiveness abroad, perhaps in contravention, or at least in perceived contravention to Western powers. But I don't think the Turkish population in general wants a bunch of Turkish soldiers coming home in body bags, particularly for something that they see as abroad. Even if the conflict in Azerbaijan or with Azerbaijan is viewed a little bit differently because of the ethnic and linguistic connections between the two sides. So the Syrians provide a good way to you know, provide more, I guess, manpower to assist in these offensives. The Syrians who go, by all accounts, are poor. So there she is. Are poor, destitute, and are doing this for money, and are, again, by all reports, thrown together, kind of as they go. So they haven't really trained together, even if they have gotten Turkish training. So we're not talking about the elite of the elite here. I hate to be crude, but these people are cannon fodder. And they are shoved to the front, and they ultimately become expendables in Turkish wars abroad. It's kind of a sad situation, but it's not all that atypical to use as an external power, particularly if you're trying to mask your involvement, or at least, you know, mask your on-the-ground involvement by using a third party or a private military contractor. The Turks just use Syrians in that role rather than you know, in the case of the U.S., you know, others, or in the case of the Russians, you know, the Wagner Group. And I'll stop here. The last point is that the Syrian mercenaries, those seem to engender hard pushback from other external actors. So where people would perhaps be willing to countenance some level of Turkish special forces, which I'm sure they're there, but, you know, more overt Turkish role on the ground, when these Syrian mercenaries start to show up is when you start to see, in my opinion, some hardening of attitudes against Ankara. So they are a net negative, if you ask me, in terms of Turkish soft power. But for Ankara, they're just simply an enabler of their own ground offensive, if that makes sense. So I'll stop there.
Does anyone else want to jump into it, anything to this? Okay. Okay, so here now we have the next question about the role of Israel. It says, what role has Israel played in this conflict? Maybe we can talk a little bit more about Israel, but also about Iran. I don't think we've said enough about this.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I'll combine maybe some of that with some of the previous things as well. I mean, first of all, on the UN, I mean, the UN can issue whatever statements that it wants. No one is going to do any peace enforcement, right? There's no one's lining up to say we're going to deploy a force and enforce a settlement or a ceasefire. So, and in that regard too, and I could have mentioned this, and this may also be playing a role, is, you know, Nagorno-Karabakh looked at that first meeting at the White House between the Serbian government representatives and Kosovo's representatives, and maybe thinking, look, you know, at some point everyone will bow to the inevitable about Nagorno-Karabakh becoming independent the same way Kosovo became independent. You just have to wait long enough, and then everyone starts to recognize that as a fait accompli, and that may have also played into the Azeri connections. Look, Israel is a provider of military equipment, advanced technology. Israel has always looked at Azerbaijan as a strategic asset vis-a-vis Iran. Iran has always looked at Armenia as one of the ways at which Iran has escaped encirclement or at least pressure. But Iran also has an important economic lifeline now through Azerbaijan, the whole north-south corridor, which is essentially one of the ways Iran gets around the possibility of certainly the Persian Gulf being blocked off, but also against, you know, U.S. economic pressures to have this lifeline both by rail and then across the Caspian Sea to Azerbaijan, to Russia. So that has an impact. You have the Iranian-Turkish relationship, which has developed in recent years, where Iran and Turkey and Russia work together, or at least sometimes try to work together to stabilize events in Syria. The Turkish-Israeli relationship has gone downhill. So we have all of these moving parts, I guess, is really what I'm trying to get at with this. And, you know, it makes it hard then to have black and white, we are on your side and against someone else. The only really black and white players that you have is Turkey vis-a-vis Armenia and its relationship with Azerbaijan. But everyone else, Iran, Russia, Israel, and then the United States and others, have relationships with both of the parties. And no one is willing to foreclose one relationship for the other. I think that's another factor that is part of this process. Miro was talking about Georgia. Georgia has relationships with both. It has ethnic minorities of both Azeris and Azerbaijanis. It needs to keep a certain degree of it doesn't want to have to choose one or the other in a way that's definitive. And I think this is why people are maneuvering around in this. One last thing I actually just was thinking when Bob was talking about the Syrians, also again, second and third order effects. Syrians that take up these offers to go to Libya, to go to the Caucasus, also this serves Russian interests because it's taking people who might stay in Syria and keep fighting and takes them out of Syria. And it's a way to kind of get squaring the circle of, do we keep people in Idlib where they might keep fighting, or do you say to them, look, we're gonna, you get an opportunity to go somewhere else, earn some money, potentially be, have refuge somewhere else, whether in Libya, probably more in the case of Libya. And for Russia, yes, the Russians condemn, oh, it's terrible, but I think at the same time, the Russians don't see the benefit. And again, being very cold, very, very cold-blooded about this, because I think, Bob's point about cannon fodder is apropos here. But it solves a problem Russia has in Syria, which is, where do some of the rebel opposition fighters go if they can't stay in Idlib? Or if they stay in Idlib, they're going to keep fighting, and that creates problems there. If those people go somewhere else, then Russian interests are served there. So that's why this conflict is, not to use the cliche of a Matryoshka doll, but yes, you start opening it up and you start seeing that there are pieces within pieces, and then it connects to other things. We haven't even touched on the Greek and Cypriot reaction, because obviously with Turkey doing what it's doing in the Eastern Mediterranean, that has changed kind of the Greek calculus, and then the Greek calculus and France's calculus changes NATO's calculus. You can see how this suddenly isn't just a little isolated conflict in the mountains of the South Caucasus, but starts to connect and touch on other things.
Thank you, Nick. I have a question from Adrian Basora. I'm going to ask Bob to take this one. It says, can you discuss the current status of the Turkey-Russia political and military relationship in a bit greater depth than done so far, and give us your estimate as to what the Nagorno-Karabakh crisis is likely to do to that relationship? And I just want to quickly add, just a couple of weeks ago, we published an edited volume, which was co-edited by Bob, Aaron, and Chris Miller, about Russia's war in Syria, what that means for the US, but obviously that mentions Turkey quite a bit as well. So I recommend checking that out on our website. But Bob, go ahead.
Sure. So yeah, I'm actually doing some research and working on a project on the Russia-Turkey relationship with a colleague from FPRI. So it's something we've been looking at closely for the past couple of months. Turkey and Russia, I guess I would summarize it by saying Turkey and Russia have been really good at not allowing areas where their interests collide to derail the overall relationship, at least since 2016. So in Syria, they're largely on the same side in terms of the Astana process, right? The Assad regime, Turkey, Russia, and Iran have this parallel peace process that is attempting to end the war outside of the US and UN-led process. In Libya, they're on opposite sides of the civil war there, but they've managed not to come into direct contact with each other. Nagorno-Karabakh, Turkey is clearly all in on one side. I think Russia really is trying to balance its interests, and I agree with your points, Nick, that the conflict serves Russia's interests in a lot of ways, but I think Moscow would, at this point, prefer that the fighting stop as soon as possible, and that's why they're holding, the peace talks in Moscow today. Because these things have even though they're geopolitically useful, sometimes at the start, they often have a way of spiraling out of control of any party who tries to use a conflict like this to further its geopolitical interests. So. Turkey and Russia have significant economic ties, but in some ways now they've become energy competitors in the Black Sea region. They have, Putin and Erdogan have been called sort of political twins in terms of, they arose very differently through the political systems. Putin is very much an insider. Erdogan, and Aaron knows this a lot better than I do, but Erdogan in a lot of ways was an outsider, spent some time in prison when he crossed the previous government. So, but nevertheless, in terms of how they see the domestic political system, how they would like to structure their domestic political systems, their tolerance of opposition, they're very much sort of kindred spirits politically. Russia and Turkey both have this. I think it was Fiona Hill who talked about the axis of the estranged, in terms of Turkey and Russia both feeling left out, or even rejected by Europe and the West. And so, for all those reasons, I think that the Turkey-Russia relationship is fairly resilient. They're very pragmatic at managing their differences. Even when the Turks shot down a Russian fighter in Syria in November of 2015, it didn't escalate past that. Even when Idlib escalated earlier this year, and the Turks intervened very directly after the Syrian armed forces killed 35 Turkish soldiers in Idlib. Turkey intervened very directly and dealt the Syrian regime a serious blow. Nevertheless, Erdogan flew to Moscow. He and Putin sat down. They signed a de-escalation agreement, or agreed to de-escalate the situation in Idlib, and they've been able to manage the areas where their differences collide really effectively, very pragmatically, very effectively. Prediction is always dangerous, but I don't see any major reason why, absent a significant Turkish misstep or a significant overt Turkish escalation, I don't see any reason why Moscow and Ankara can't manage their differences in Nagorno-Karabakh as well.
If I could jump in here, I would say the linchpin of the current relationship is actually Turkey's decision to purchase the S-400. And so you had the Turkish national security elite, despite being presented by the United States about the consequences of this, And the consequences were twofold. One is that you would essentially be booted from the F-35 program, and the other one is that you would face American sanctions. The Trump administration has held off on sanctions, but Turkey has been booted from the F-35 program, and Defense News covered it quite well. Is that on top of that, layered on top of that, is there's a de facto American arms embargo on Turkey. That's part of the S-400, but that's also part of Turkey's invasion of Syria in October 2019, called Operation Peace Spring, which is, I believe we're at the 1-year anniversary. The 1-year anniversary was today or yesterday. And so you have all these sort of things that are going on. And then just a thing to watch, is that on October 20th, Turkey has suggested that it's going to test the S-400 with a live fire test. Now, that may not result in immediate American action because we're 20 days away from an election. We're in the ultra super silly season of American politics. But post-November, particularly if there's a change in government, and if you read 538, the probabilities are higher that we'll have a new president, in January than an old one, than the current one. And even if not, the political winds are such that the American-Turkish relationship will remain very frosty. And the Russians, and this is where I agree with Nick too, know this, and they don't have to do anything. One of the interesting things about the S-400, and this is very opaque, but I'm not even certain, Turkey has spent even more than a couple, Turkey essentially relied upon a Russian loan and Russian financing. So they haven't even shelled out a lot of money for it. But they still are on the hook to make interest payments and loan payments every single month or however it is that they worked out their agreement. So you have the basic for an iterative relationship built around a sophisticated piece of military equipment. And before Nagorno-Karabakh, lots and lots of talk that the second part of that agreement, which was the agreement for the second regiment of the S-400, that they were getting close to finalizing that agreement, which would, in theory, entail some sort of production of S-400 components in Turkey. So, I do see, the Russian-Turkish relationship being enduring, interest-based, pragmatic, even if they squabble in Libya, even if they squabble in Syria, and even if they're even if they're on the opposite sides in Nagorno-Karabakh, they've become symbiotic actors where one needs the other. In Syria, the two sides need each other. In Libya, the two sides need each other. Nagorno-Karabakh may be a little different, but it's something worth watching. And I'll stop there before I have a meltdown of a child.
Thank you, Aaron. I want to turn this next question to Elene. Are Azeri and Armenian domestic politics primarily responsible for the failure to resolve the conflict since the ceasefire in 1994, or are international politics more important? What is the likely outcome of this conflict? Again, I don't think we can talk about that enough.
Yeah, I don't think about the last part of what's the outcome. It's completely up to the parties. But yes, to the first part of the question, it is. And I think that domestic politics is the major stumbling point in negotiations and in the progress of bilateral relations, also relations between Armenia and Turkey. Because I think what is important to understand for the political elites of both countries is that the human life is more important than symbolic capital, in this case land or some architectural building or whatever things are included in this idea of Karabakh. Because it's more than just the land, it's the total idea, it's the symbol of being Armenian and etc., etc. So what I think the political elites have used this as the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict as a commodity, as a political commodity, which brings political dividend. And it's very, very easy compared to other economic or or development goals, particularly for Armenia, which is sort of a landlocked country without a lot of natural resources. And Armenia is in the situation where it has only 4 neighbors, and it doesn't have any diplomatic relations with 2 of them. It's Turkey and Azerbaijan. So I think what's important is that the change of mindset in the society is the major issue in this conflict. And then the international politics can do something or cannot, because of the enmity between these 2 countries, the countries like Turkey and Russia are capable to manipulate them. If there was sort of dialogue, a conversation between them, it will not be so easy for Russia or Turkey or whoever else to intervene so easily and have such a tremendous influence on political outcome of every single issue regarding Nagorno-Karabakh. And yeah, what's the outcome? As I said, probably the change of mindset, and I think maybe new generation of Armenians and Azerbaijanis can appreciate peace and the opportunities and possibilities the interaction and communication brings, rather than enmity and trade with S-400s and S-300s and Iskanders and etc. Thanks.
Thank you, Elene. Miro, you had your hand raised, so I'll give you a chance to comment, and then we can go to Bob afterwards. We cannot hear you, though.
Yeah, I would agree. Domestic politics play a significant role, particularly in Armenia. As we say, the president, Prime Minister Pashinyan has lost some political capital. So now he has kind of moved to more nationalist stance, and 2 elements I would make. It's very important. One, he went to Nagorno-Karabakh and he said, this is Armenia. So this was very important element, and it was kind of like rallying around the flag. So to gain more nationalist support, and he withdrew from Madrid principles. This was kind of like a peace. This was a kind of how to call the peace plan to get both parties to the table and solve the problem. So these 2 elements, I think, really changed the dynamic between these 2 countries. So yeah, that's what I wanted to add. So domestic politics, important role in Armenian case.
Yeah, and I would just add, so this idea of whether the roots of the conflict are domestic or international, or I think, so it's useful. These are useful simplifications to say, is it domestic or is it international? My sense is that all of these conflicts arise from the interaction of domestic politics and international relations, right? So if you look at any of the frozen conflicts, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Transnistria, Nagorno-Karabakh, none of the separatist regions, none of these conflicts could have escalated to full-scale war without external intervention. In NK, it was from Armenia. In the Moldovan and Georgian wars, it was from Russia or from Confederation of the Mountain Peoples, but coming from Russian territory in the case of Abkhazia. But nevertheless, there's always interaction of domestic and international politics at play, I think, in these civil wars and separatist wars. And then specifically to domestic politics in terms of recurrence. So there's a reason that one of the biggest predictors of civil war is time since the last civil war in that country, right? So the shorter period of time you have from the end of the last civil war, the higher likelihood another war will start. And part of that is because of the discourse and the discursive frameworks and the narratives that leaders deploy. Elena, you talked about the dehumanization, the vilification, and as long as that's still alive in the historical memory and there are generations that remember that vilification and dehumanization, it's easier to deploy those arguments again and I think get a receptive audience. So unfortunately, in this case, in this conflict, there's not been a lot of time since each of the escalations, and this escalation, which has been such a large escalation, so significant, and has drawn in outside powers and has drawn in, has allowed leaders to deploy some of those same old narratives, you know, about the Turks and the Christian-Muslim competition and all these things that are now coming to the fore again. Probably even if and when this escalation is resolved, makes it more likely that there'll be another escalation in the near future.
Thank you, Bob. I want to thank each one of you for joining us today. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but we're going to keep watching the conflict. Actually, next Wednesday at 12 p.m., that's on October 14th, I will be joined by Dr. Gerard Toll and John O'Loughlin, who will tell us a little bit more about the conflict, and maybe we will have a ceasefire by then. Bob, Elena, Nick, Miro, Aaron, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our audience, and thanks for staying so engaged in the Q&A. Aaron, did you want to add anything?
Well, just a plug for FPRI. You know, we feel like we're a great venue to hold these conversations because of the people that we can bring together and our area of expertise, particularly in the former Soviet Union. My daughter appreciates everybody coming along and seeing this. This is life in the pandemic in the Stein household because my wife's on a Zoom call. So I'm going to be quiet now. Just make sure to go to fpri.org to check out our website and make sure to follow the Eurasia program's work because, you know, this is where the magic happens. We're done now.
Thank you so much.